I never intended to keep my true life hidden from my family for 7 years. But when your own brother calls you worthless at every family gathering while you're secretly running a multi-million-dollar empire, sometimes the truth becomes a weapon you're saving for the right moment. That moment came at my father's 65th birthday party, when my brother's boss walked into our dining room and changed everything with two simple words. "Yes, ma'am." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Clearwater, and according to my family, I was the embodiment of wasted potential. The daughter who, quote, threw away her future by dropping out of her prestigious law program at Westfield University to pursue what my mother dismissively called arts and crafts. For the past 7 years, I had let them believe I was struggling, barely making ends meet with my small online jewelry business, living paycheck to paycheck in my modest apartment on Maple Street in downtown Riverside. What they didn't know was that Victoria's vintage treasures had evolved far beyond handmade earrings sold on social media. What started as a simple Etsy shop had transformed into Clearwater luxury brands, a conglomerate of high-end fashion companies that I owned and operated under various business names. My little jewelry hobby now employed over 400 people across 3 states, with flagship stores in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Last year alone, my companies generated $180 million in revenue. But to my family, I was still the disappointing daughter who couldn't finish what she started. The deception hadn't been intentional at first. When I'd left law school, the family's reaction had been so harsh, so filled with shame and disappointment, that I'd simply let them think what they wanted to think. When my business started growing, I was too focused on building my empire to correct their assumptions. When the money started pouring in, I was too hurt by their lack of faith to share my success. And somewhere along the way, watching how they treated me when they thought I was a failure became a strange kind of social experiment. I lived modestly, drove a 5-year-old Honda Civic, and wore clothes from Target and Walmart whenever I visited family. My real wardrobe, filled with designer pieces from my own fashion lines, stayed hidden in my actual home, a sprawling estate in the affluent Hillcrest neighborhood that my family had never seen. The modest apartment they knew about was just a convenient fiction, a place I rented specifically to maintain the illusion of struggle. My brother, Cameron Clearwater, had no such struggles with family perception. At 34, 2 years my senior, he was everything our parents had dreamed of in a son. Harvard Law graduate, partner track at Hartwell & Associates, one of Riverside's most prestigious law firms, married to the perfectly polished Penelope, father to twin boys who attended private school. Cameron lived in a beautiful colonial house in Riverside Heights, drove a BMW, and wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was also the cruelest person I'd ever known. "Victoria's here with her little homemade trinkets again," he'd announce whenever I arrived at family gatherings, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did you bring us some of those friendship bracelets you've been peddling online?" The family would chuckle politely, and I would smile and nod, playing the part of the struggling artist's sister who was just grateful to be included. What they didn't know was that the little trinkets Cameron mocked were actually prototypes from my upcoming luxury line, pieces that would retail for thousands of dollars and had already generated millions in pre-orders from high-end boutiques worldwide. My parents, Linda and Robert Clearwater, had long since given up any hope that I would amount to anything significant. Dad, a retired engineer, would pat my shoulder sympathetically and ask if I needed help with my little business. Mom, a former teacher, would sigh dramatically whenever someone asked about her children, always leading with Cameron's achievements and mentioning me as an afterthought, if at all. "Cameron just made partner at his firm," she'd beam, "and Victoria is still trying to figure things out." At 32 years old, while running a business empire that dwarfed most of their friends' life achievements, the most painful part wasn't the mockery or the dismissal, it was the genuine pity in their eyes. They truly believed I was a failure, a disappointment who had squandered every opportunity they'd given me. They spoke to me the way you'd speak to a child who couldn't quite grasp why their finger painting wasn't hanging in an art museum. I had become an expert at playing down to their expectations. I'd perfected the art of looking slightly overwhelmed when they talked about real careers and money. I'd mastered the skill of appearing grateful when they offered unsolicited advice about getting my life together. I could make my successful, confident self so small that I practically disappeared into their narrative of who they needed me to be. But maintaining this double life was becoming increasingly difficult. My companies were growing too large, my success too visible in certain circles. I'd been featured in Forbes, interviewed by business magazines, and invited to speak at entrepreneurship conferences. The awards were piling up in my real office. Entrepreneur of the Year, Rising Business Leader, Innovation in Fashion. Yet at family dinners, I was still the girl who played with beads. The irony wasn't lost on me that Cameron, for all his Harvard credentials and law firm prestige, was still essentially an employee. A well-paid, highly respected employee, but an employee nonetheless. While I, the family disappointment, was the one actually building something, creating jobs, making decisions that affected hundreds of people's livelihoods. But they would never see it that way. In their minds, Cameron was the success story, and I was the cautionary tale. Tonight was going to be different, though I didn't know it yet. Tonight, the carefully constructed walls between my two lives were about to come crashing down in the most unexpected way possible. Because sometimes, the universe has its own sense of timing, and sometimes, that timing is absolutely perfect. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dad's 65th birthday party was being held at the family home on Sycamore Avenue, the same house where Cameron and I had grown up, where every family milestone had been celebrated for the past 3 decades. The dining room was decorated with blue and silver balloons, and Mom had gone all out with catering from Romano's, Dad's favorite Italian restaurant. The guest list was predictably small but significant. Immediate family, a few close relatives, and some family friends who had watched both Cameron and me grow up. I arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, carrying a modest gift bag containing a watch I'd purchased from a department store. Nothing too expensive that might raise questions about my supposed financial situation. I'd spent an hour that afternoon carefully selecting my outfit. A simple navy dress from Target, comfortable flats, and the same small silver earrings I always wore to family events. Everything about my appearance was designed to reinforce their perception of me as someone just getting by. "Victoria!" Mom greeted me at the door, her smile warm but tinged with that familiar undertone of maternal worry. "You look tired, honey. Are you eating enough?" It was her standard greeting, the same concerned tone she'd used for years. In her mind, I was perpetually one missed meal away from complete collapse, struggling to keep my little business afloat while barely maintaining my basic needs. "I'm fine, Mom," I replied, giving her a hug, "just busy with some new designs." "Oh, that's wonderful, dear," she said, though her voice carried the same patronizing encouragement one might use with a child's finger painting. "Maybe this time you'll make something that catches on." If only she knew that my new designs were for next season's luxury collection, already pre-ordered by Bergdorf Goodman and Saks Fifth Avenue for a total of $12 million. The family was gathered in the living room when I walked in. Dad was in his favorite armchair, wearing the new polo shirt Cameron had bought him, looking content as he held court with Uncle Theodore and family friend Mrs. Patterson. Cameron stood near the fireplace, resplendent in what I recognized as a $3,000 Armani suit, regaling the group with some story about his latest legal victory. "And when the judge ruled in our favor, you should have seen opposing counsel's face," Cameron was saying, his voice carrying that particular blend of smugness and satisfaction that I'd come to know so well. "Sometimes it's not about the law, it's about superior strategy." the small audience murmured appreciatively. Cameron had always been gifted at making himself the center of attention, at crafting narratives, where he emerged as the brilliant hero of every situation. "Cameron, you're just so impressive," cooed Mrs. Patterson, who had taught both of us in Sunday school years ago. "Your parents must be so proud." "We certainly are," Dad beamed, his chest puffing with obvious pride. "Partner track at 34. Can you believe it?" I settled into the corner chair, the same spot I'd unconsciously claimed at family gatherings for years, close enough to participate but far enough away to avoid being the focus of attention. It was a position I'd mastered, the art of being present but invisible. "And how's your little craft business going, Victoria?" Mrs. Patterson asked, turning to me with the kind of polite interest one shows for a child's hobby. "It's going well," I replied modestly, keeping busy with orders. Cameron let out a short laugh. "Orders for what, friendship bracelets?" "Victoria's been keeping busy with her bead business for 7 years now? Still waiting for that big breakthrough." The room chuckled politely. I could see the mixture of amusement and pity in their faces, the way they looked at me like I was a well-meaning but delusional relative who still believed in fairy tales. "Now, Cameron," Mom chided gently, though she was smiling, "your sister is working hard. Not everyone can be a lawyer." The comment stung more than Cameron's direct mockery. The implication was clear. Cameron had achieved something meaningful, something important, while I was simply trying my best with limited capabilities. "I'm just saying," Cameron continued, his voice taking on that particular tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while delivering a cutting blow, "maybe it's time to consider that this isn't working out. Victoria, you're 32 years old. At some point you have to accept reality and find a real job." Uncle Theodore nodded sagely. "The boy has a point. There's no shame in admitting when something isn't working." I'm sure Cameron could put in a word at his firm. Get you something in administration, maybe. The suggestion hung in the air like a cloud of toxic gas. Cameron working to get me a job. Cameron, the successful one, helping his struggling sister find employment. The power dynamic couldn't have been more clearly established if they'd drawn an organizational chart. "That's very kind," I said quietly, "but I'm happy with what I'm doing." "Happy doesn't pay the bills," Cameron shot back. "When was the last time you took a real vacation? When was the last time you bought anything nice for yourself? Look at you. You're wearing the same clothes you wore to Christmas." I glanced down at my deliberately modest outfit, thinking about the $50,000 vacation I'd taken to the Maldives 3 months ago, carefully hidden from family's social media. I thought about the closet full of designer clothes in my real home, about the jewelry collection worth more than most people's houses. "Money isn't everything," I replied, which was true enough, though ironic given that I had more of it than anyone in this room. "Easy to say when you don't have any," Cameron said with a laugh that the others joined. Dad cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation but unwilling to directly challenge his golden child. "Well, let's not worry about all that tonight. This is supposed to be a celebration." But Cameron wasn't finished. He never was when he had an audience and a target. "I'm not trying to be mean," he continued, his voice taking on a false note of concern. "I'm worried about you, Victoria. We all are. You're living in that tiny apartment, driving a car that's falling apart, working all hours for what? Pocket change? It's not sustainable." What he didn't know was that the tiny apartment was a carefully maintained fiction, and my falling apart car was actually a strategic choice to maintain my cover. What he also didn't know was that his own salary, impressive as it was for a lawyer, represented about 2 weeks of my company's revenue. "I appreciate your concern," I said, maintaining the patient tone I'd perfected over years of these conversations, "but I'm managing fine." "Managing," Cameron repeated, shaking his head. "God, Victoria, do you hear yourself? You're 32 and you're managing." I was making 6 figures before I turned 30. I own a house, I have investments, I can provide for my family. What do you have? The question hung in the air like a challenge. What did I have? Only a business empire worth more than everyone in this room would earn in their combined lifetimes. Only the respect of industry leaders, the admiration of business peers, and the satisfaction of having built something meaningful from nothing. But to them, I had nothing. To them, I was the cautionary tale, the reminder of what happened when you made poor choices and lacked ambition. I have what I need, I said simply. Cameron's expression softened into something that might have looked like sympathy to an observer, but I recognized it as condescension wrapped in fake concern. Victoria, he said, his voice gentle in the way one might speak to a mentally challenged person, wanting things to work out doesn't make them work out. At some point, you have to face reality. Reality, if only he knew what my reality actually looked like. The conversation was mercifully interrupted by the arrival of Cameron's wife, Penelope, who swept into the room like she was gracing us with her presence. She was everything I wasn't supposed to be, perfectly polished, impeccably dressed in what I recognized as a designer outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her blonde hair styled in the kind of effortless waves that actually required hours of professional attention. "Sorry I'm late, everyone," she announced, air-kissing Mom and Dad before settling gracefully beside Cameron on the sofa. The traffic from the country club was absolutely horrible. You know how it is after the charity luncheon. The charity luncheon. I bit back a smile, remembering the email I'd received just last week from the Riverside Children's Foundation, thanking Clearwater Luxury Brands for our anonymous $500,000 donation, the largest single contribution in the organization's history. Penelope's charity luncheon had probably raised a few $1,000s through overpriced salads and silent auctions. "How did the fundraiser go, dear?" Mom asked, immediately shifting her attention to her daughter-in-law with the kind of interest she never showed in my activities. "Oh, wonderfully," Penelope beamed. "We raised almost $8,000 for the Children's Hospital. Cameron was so supportive. He bought a golf weekend package for $3,000. Wasn't that generous of him?" The room murmured its approval. $3,000. I had donated more than that to the same hospital just last month, without thinking twice about it, but of course, no one knew that. "That's my son," Dad said proudly, reaching over to pat Cameron's shoulder. "Always thinking of others." Cameron basked in the praise, straightening his tie with false modesty. "Well, it's important to give back when you're blessed with success. Some of us have been fortunate enough to achieve financial stability, and I think that comes with responsibility." His eyes flickered to me as he said it, the implication clear. Some of us have been fortunate, some of us have achieved stability, and some of us, namely me, had not. "Cameron just received another promotion," Penelope added, her voice dripping with pride. "Senior associate now, with his own secretary and everything." Mr. Hartwell himself said Cameron was the most promising young lawyer in the firm. The praise flowed like wine around the room. Uncle Theodore raised his glass. Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together. Mom practically glowed with maternal satisfaction. "Senior associate," Dad repeated, savoring the words. "You know, when Cameron was in high school, I knew he was destined for great things. Remember his debate team victories? Student body president, valedictorian. Magna cum laude from Harvard," Mom added unnecessarily. The professors all said he was exceptional. I had graduated summa cum laude from the same university before transferring to pursue my business degree, but that achievement had been overshadowed by my decision to leave law school. In their narrative, my academic success was just another example of wasted potential. "And now look at him," Uncle Theodore chimed in. "Beautiful wife, gorgeous home, twin boys, who are already showing signs of inheriting their father's intelligence. The American dream, right there." Cameron accepted the accolades with practiced humility, the same way he'd been accepting them since childhood. He was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the family's greatest achievement and source of endless pride. "We just bought the boys' new bikes," Penelope announced. "Top of the line, custom painted. Cameron insisted on the best." He says if you're going to invest in your children's happiness, don't cut corners. That's wonderful, Mom cooed. Victoria, you should see these boys on their bikes. They're naturals, just like their father was at their age. I forced a smile and nodded appropriately. What I didn't mention was that I had actually seen the boys on their bikes. They lived 3 houses down from my real home in Hillcrest. I'd watched them learning to ride in their driveway, wobbling and laughing under Cameron's patient instruction. It was one of the few times I'd seen my brother display genuine warmth, and it reminded me that underneath all his arrogance and cruelty, he was still capable of love. It made his treatment of me even more painful, somehow. Cameron's thinking about running for city council next year, Penelope continued, clearly on a roll. Mr. Hartwell thinks he'd be perfect for it. Young, successful, connected to the community, the kind of leader Riverside needs. The suggestion was met with enthusiastic support from everyone in the room. Of course Cameron should run for office. Of course he'd be perfect for public service. Of course he represented everything the community aspired to be. Politics, Dad mused thoughtfully. You know, I always thought you had the temperament for it, son. You've got that ability to command a room, to make people listen to you. It's all about public service, Cameron said with the kind of noble tone that made me want to roll my eyes. When you've been blessed with success, you have an obligation to use that success to help others. More murmurs of approval. More praise for Cameron's character and vision. What about you, Victoria? Mrs. Patterson asked suddenly, turning to me with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Have you ever thought about getting involved in community service? Maybe volunteer work? The question hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of everyone's attention shifting to me. In their minds, this was probably a gentle suggestion, a way for the unsuccessful sister to find some small measure of purpose and meaning. I do some volunteer work, I said quietly. That's wonderful, Mom said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of surprised approval, as if she couldn't quite believe I was capable of contributing to society. What kind of volunteer work? I thought about the business mentorship program I ran for young entrepreneurs, the scholarship fund I'd established for women pursuing business degrees, the quarterly workshops I conducted at the local women's shelter to help residents develop business skills, all done anonymously, of course, through various foundations and organizations. Just some mentoring, I replied vaguely, helping people with business questions. Cameron laughed, not unkindly but with clear amusement. Business questions? Victoria, what business advice could you possibly give? You can barely keep your own venture afloat. Now, Cameron, Penelope chided gently, though she was smiling. Maybe Victoria has some insights about small business struggles. Sometimes failure teaches you things success doesn't. Failure. There was that word again, casually thrown around like it was my defining characteristic. In their world, I was the expert on failure. The cautionary tale who might have some wisdom about what not to do. I'm sure you mean well, Uncle Theodore added diplomatically. But people need real guidance. They need advice from someone who's actually built something substantial. Someone who's actually built something substantial. I looked around the room at these people who thought they knew me, who had created an entire narrative about who I was and what I was capable of. They saw me as the well-meaning but ineffective sister, the one who tried hard but lacked the intelligence, drive, or skill to achieve anything meaningful. Meanwhile, Cameron continued to hold court, regaling the group with stories of his latest legal victories, his networking successes, his plans for the future. Every word reinforced his position as the family's shining star, the proof that hard work and intelligence could lead to genuine achievement. The partners at the firm have been incredibly supportive, he was saying. Mr. Hartwell took me to lunch last week just to discuss my career trajectory. He sees partner potential in me, maybe within the next 5 years. Partner potential. 5 years. I did quick mental math. In 5 years, if my companies continued growing at their current rate, I'd be approaching $500 million in annual revenue. But none of them would ever know that. That's extraordinary, Dad said, his voice thick with emotion. To think that my son might be a partner at Hartwell & Associates. Your grandfather would have been so proud. The mention of Grandpa Clearwater hit me unexpectedly hard. He had been the one person in the family who had always believed in me, who had encouraged my entrepreneurial spirit, even when I was 8 years old selling homemade bookmarks to neighbors. He'd died during my second year of building the business, never knowing that his faith in me had been justified. Grandpa always said Cameron had the makings of a leader. Mom added softly, he could spot potential in people. What she didn't say, but what everyone in the room understood, was that Grandpa had apparently spotted no such potential in me. In their revisionist history, he had seen Cameron's greatness, but had somehow missed whatever small spark I might have possessed. The truth was more complicated, but I had never bothered to correct their assumptions. What was the point? Cameron stood up, straightening his expensive suit jacket, and raised his wine glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he announced. "To Dad, who taught me the value of hard work and integrity. To Mom, who always believed in me. To Penelope, who makes every success worth achieving. And to family, the people who matter most." Everyone raised their glasses, including me. As we drank, I caught Cameron's eye across the room. For just a moment, I thought I saw something there, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe even regret. But then it was gone, replaced by his usual confident smile. He had everything he'd ever wanted: respect, success, a beautiful family, and the unwavering admiration of everyone who mattered to him. What more could the golden child possibly need? As dinner was served, the conversation naturally evolved into what I had come to think of as Victoria's improvement hour, that inevitable portion of family gatherings where everyone felt compelled to offer unsolicited advice about how I could fix my supposedly broken life. It was a ritual as predictable as grace before meals, and twice as painful. Aunt Beatrice, Dad's younger sister who had driven up from Millbrook for the occasion, was the first to launch into what she clearly considered helpful guidance. Beatrice worked as a human resources manager at a mid-sized insurance company and considered herself an expert on career development. "You know, Victoria," she said, cutting into her chicken parmesan, "I was talking to my supervisor last week about entry-level positions. We're always looking for people in customer service. The pay isn't spectacular, maybe $30,000 to start, but it's steady work with benefits. Real benefits, not like whatever you're trying to cobble together on your own." The suggestion hung in the air like a generous offer. $30,000. I made that much in profit every few hours, but I was supposed to be grateful for this lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "That's very thoughtful of you, Aunt Beatrice," I replied politely, "but I'm content with my current situation." Cameron nearly choked on his wine. "Content?" "Victoria, contentment is what people say when they've given up on success. You're 32 years old. Beatrice is offering you a real opportunity here." "Customer service is an excellent foundation," Penelope chimed in, her voice taking on the tone of someone dispensing wisdom to the less fortunate. "My cousin started in customer service and worked her way up to middle management. She's quite happy now." Middle management. Quite happy. These were the aspirations my family held for me, not success, not achievement, not even moderate prosperity, but the possibility of someday reaching middle management and being quite happy with my small life. Uncle Theodore set down his fork and leaned forward with the gravity of someone about to share profound insights. "The problem, Victoria, is that you've been living in a fantasy. This whole entrepreneur thing sounds impressive, but let's be honest, it's not working. How long are you going to keep pretending that selling trinkets online is a real business?" The word trinkets stung more than I cared to admit. My latest collection had been featured in Vogue's Must-Have Accessories and had generated $8 million in orders within the first week of launch. But to Uncle Theodore, they were trinkets. "Sometimes," he continued, warming to his theme, "the bravest thing you can do is admit defeat and try a different path. There's no shame in accepting that you're not cut out for business." "Exactly," Cameron agreed, his voice taking on that particular tone he used when he wanted to sound wise and caring rather than cruel. "Look, Victoria, I've seen real entrepreneurs. I represent them. They have business plans, investors, actual revenue streams. What you have is a hobby that's gotten out of hand." Mrs. Patterson nodded sagely. "My nephew tried to start his own landscaping business for 3 years. 3 years of struggle, barely making ends meet, stressing his poor wife to death. Finally, he swallowed his pride and got a job with the city parks department. Benefits, pension, steady hours. He's much happier now." The implication was clear. I should follow the nephew's example, abandon my delusions of grandeur, and find the security of employed life. In their minds, this wasn't criticism. It was compassion. Mom reached over and patted my hand with the kind of gentle sympathy usually reserved for terminal illness patients. "Sweetheart, we just want what's best for you. We've watched you struggle for so long, and it breaks our hearts. Maybe it's time to consider that there might be other paths to happiness." Other paths to happiness. Translation: give up on your dreams and settle for whatever scraps the world might throw you. "I've actually been thinking," Dad said, his voice carefully measured, "that maybe we've been enabling this situation. Maybe by not pushing harder, we've allowed Victoria to avoid facing reality." The word enabling hit like a physical blow. In their narrative, my family's support, such as it was, had actually been a disservice, preventing me from accepting my limitations and finding appropriate work for someone of my modest capabilities. Penelope leaned forward conspiratorially. "You know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with working for someone else. Cameron loves his job, and look how successful he's become. Some people are natural leaders, and others are natural followers. Both are valuable." Natural followers. That's what they saw when they looked at me. Someone who lacked the fundamental qualities necessary for leadership or independent success. In their hierarchy, I was destined to be led, managed, and directed by people like Cameron. "The thing is," Cameron said, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child, "real success requires certain qualities. Vision, leadership, the ability to make tough decisions under pressure. It's not for everyone. There's no shame in that. Most people aren't cut out for it." Most people aren't cut out for it. The implication being that I was definitely among the most people who lacked whatever mysterious qualities separated achievers from everyone else. Aunt Beatrice reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "Here's my supervisor's direct number. Just mention that you're my niece. She'll at least give you an interview." She slid the card across the table toward me like she was handing me a winning lottery ticket. In her mind, this small gesture, leveraging her connection to possibly secure me a $30,000 per year customer service position, was an act of profound generosity. "You could start next month," she continued enthusiastically. "Get yourself established, maybe save up for a nicer apartment. Who knows? In a few years, you might even be able to afford a car payment on something newer." A nicer apartment, a car payment. These were the heights of ambition my family held for me. They weren't even dreaming of success on my behalf. They were hoping I might someday achieve basic financial stability. Uncle Theodore pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be job listings. "There are actually quite a few opportunities right now for people with your profile. Administrative assistant positions, retail management, even some receptionist jobs at professional offices." He rattled off a list of positions that would have represented massive pay cuts from what my company's receptionists earned, let alone what I made personally. But he presented each one like it was a golden opportunity perfectly suited to my limited skill set. "The key," Mrs. Patterson added helpfully, "is managing expectations. Once you accept that you're not going to be running Microsoft, you can find satisfaction in smaller achievements." Not going to be running Microsoft. The casual dismissal of any possibility that I might achieve something significant was breathtaking in its completeness. They weren't just doubting my current path, they were categorically ruling out any future where I might succeed at anything meaningful. Cameron, clearly feeling magnanimous after the wine and praise, decided to make what he probably considered a generous offer. "Look, Victoria, I've been thinking about this for a while. Hartwell & Associates needs someone to handle filing, answer phones, Maybe do some light clerical work. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work, and you'd be learning from successful people. I could put in a word." The room went silent as everyone absorbed this magnanimous gesture. Cameron, the successful lawyer, was offering to help his struggling sister secure employment as his firm's filing clerk. In their minds, this was an act of sibling loyalty and professional generosity. "That's so thoughtful of you, Cameron," Mom said, her voice thick with emotion. "To give Victoria that kind of opportunity." "It really is," Dad agreed. "Not many people would be willing to stick their neck out for family like that." Stick his neck out. By possibly helping me get a minimum wage clerical position at his law firm. The idea that Cameron would be taking any kind of professional risk by recommending me for filing work was so absurd that I almost laughed out loud. "Think about it," Cameron continued, clearly pleased with his own generosity. "You'd have a steady paycheck, health insurance, maybe even some vacation days. And you'd be around successful people every day. You could learn how real businesses operate. As opposed to my fake business, which apparently didn't count as real despite employing hundreds of people and generating millions in revenue." "Plus," Penelope added with what she clearly thought was encouraging enthusiasm, "you'd finally have something impressive to tell people when they ask what you do for work." "I work at Hartwell & Associates" sounds so much better than, well, whatever it is you tell people now. The casual cruelty of it was stunning. My sister-in-law had just suggested that my current work was so embarrassing that even entry-level clerical work would be a step up in terms of social respectability. "Just promise me you'll think about it," Cameron said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand in what he probably thought was a brotherly gesture of support. "I hate seeing you struggle like this. We all do. You deserve better than this constant stress and uncertainty. You deserve better." Coming from someone who thought better meant filing papers at his law firm for $12 an hour. As I sat there listening to my family plan out my supposedly improved future, I couldn't help but think about what my real Monday morning would actually look like. While they imagined me gratefully accepting a filing position at Cameron's law firm, I would be walking into the executive boardroom of Clearwater Tower, the 40-story glass and steel monument to success that bore my family name, though none of them knew I owned it. The building had been my most audacious purchase yet. When Morrison Development had gone bankrupt 18 months ago, their flagship property had gone up for auction. I'd acquired it through Sterling Holdings, one of my shell companies, and had quietly rebranded it. The Clearwater name now graced the most prestigious address in Riverside's business district, visible from the highway that Cameron drove every day to his law firm. He passed my building twice daily, never knowing that his struggling sister owned the most valuable piece of commercial real estate in the city. Monday would begin with my 8 a.m. executive meeting, where we'd review the quarterly performance of all 3 divisions of Clearwater luxury brands. The jewelry division, which my family still thought of as Victoria's little bead business, had just signed an exclusive contract with Nordstrom worth $45 million over 3 years. The accessories line, which they dismissed as trinkets, was about to launch in partnership with a major European fashion house, a deal I'd been negotiating personally with the CEO of Milano Designs for the past 6 months. But it was the 3rd division that would have shocked them most. Clearwater Consulting had become one of the most sought-after business strategy firms on the East Coast. We specialized in helping struggling companies restructure and grow, and our client list read like a who's who of American business. Just last month, I'd personally consulted on a merger that had made front-page news in the Wall Street Journal, though my involvement was carefully kept confidential. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family was debating whether I was capable of filing papers, I was actually the person other business leaders came to when they needed to save their companies. My office on the 38th floor overlooked the entire city of Riverside. From my desk, I could see Cameron's modest law firm building, Uncle Theodore's insurance office, even the country club where Penelope had held her charity luncheon. Sometimes, during particularly stressful negotiations or difficult decisions, I would look out at those buildings and remind myself that the little girl they still saw when they looked at me had built something that literally towered over their entire world. The numbers alone would have staggered them. Last year's revenue of $180 million was just the beginning. This year, we were projected to break $250 million, and I had 3 major acquisitions in the pipeline that would push us toward the $500 million mark by 2026. The trinket business that Uncle Theodore mocked generated more profit in a single quarter than his insurance company had made in its entire 20-year history. But it wasn't just about the money, though the financial success was undeniably satisfying. It was about what I had built from nothing. When I'd left law school 7 years ago, I'd had exactly $3,247 in my checking account and a head full of business ideas that my family had dismissed as fantasy. The first year had been genuinely difficult, not the fake struggle I now performed for their benefit, but real challenges of building a business from scratch. I remembered those early days with a mixture of nostalgia and pride. Working 18-hour days in my actual tiny apartment, taking orders at 2 a.m., learning about supply chains and manufacturing through trial and expensive error. There had been moments when I'd wondered if my family was right, if I was delusional to think I could build something meaningful. The turning point had come during year 2, when a small boutique in Manhattan had ordered 50 pieces from my collection for their window display. A fashion blogger had photographed the window and posted it on Instagram, where it had gone viral. Within a week, I'd received orders from boutiques across the country. Within a month, I'd had to hire my first employees. That was when I'd made the decision that would define everything that followed. I would build my empire in secret. The initial reasoning had been practical. I didn't want family interference or unsolicited advice from people who had never run businesses. But as the company grew and their treatment of me remained condescending, the secrecy had become something more deliberate. By year 3, when Clearwater luxury brands had expanded into accessories and I'd acquired my first manufacturing facility, I could have easily revealed my success. The company was profitable, growing, and respected within the industry. But by then, I'd realized something profound about my family's behavior. Their treatment of me wasn't based on my actual circumstances. It was based on their need to maintain a particular family hierarchy. Cameron needed to be the successful one. He needed to be the child who had fulfilled their parents' dreams, who had achieved everything they'd hoped for. My role in the family dynamic was to be the cautionary tale, the reminder of what happened when you made poor choices. If I suddenly became successful, it would disrupt the entire narrative they'd constructed about themselves and their world. So I'd continued to play the part, even as my business empire grew beyond what any of them could imagine. I maintained the modest apartment as a prop, drove the aging Honda as a costume piece, and wore Target clothes to family gatherings like an actor staying in character. The performance had become so natural that sometimes I almost forgot it was a performance at all. The past 4 years had brought achievements that should have been family celebrations. Forbes had named me one of their 30 under 30 inches entrepreneurs, though the article had used only my initials and a carefully cropped photo that obscured my face. Harvard Business School had invited me to speak at their entrepreneurship conference. The governor of our state had personally called to thank me for the jobs I'd created. I kept copies of these accolades in a safe in my real home, along with the contracts, financial statements, and awards that told the true story of my life. Sometimes, late at night after particularly brutal family gatherings, I would sit in my home office and look through these documents, reminding myself of who I really was beneath the character I played for their benefit. The most recent addition to that collection was a letter from the Riverside Economic Development Council, formally recognizing Clearwater luxury brands as the largest private employer in the city. We'd created 847 local jobs over the past 3 years, more than Cameron's law firm, Uncle Theodore's insurance company, and Penelope's charity work combined. I was officially the most economically impactful person in our family, and they thought I needed their help to get a filing job. But perhaps the most surreal aspect of my double life was how it had affected my relationship with money itself. When you're secretly worth tens of millions of dollars but have to pretend you're struggling to pay rent, your entire relationship with spending becomes performative. I owned 3 homes but had to remember to complain about my expensive apartment. I had a garage full of luxury cars but had to maintain my Honda as if it were my only transportation option. The psychological toll of living this way was something I'd never anticipated. There were days when I almost forgot which version of myself was real. Was I Victoria, the struggling jewelry maker, grateful for her family's patience and support? Or was I Victoria, the business mogul, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the state? Sometimes the line between performance and reality blurred so completely that I felt like I was losing pieces of my authentic self. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow I would walk into Clearwater Tower as myself, the real me, the successful me, the version of Victoria Clearwater who had built an empire while her family planned her rescue from imaginary failure. Tomorrow I would remember what it felt like to be respected, valued, and recognized for what I had actually accomplished. Tonight, though, I was still the family disappointment, listening to their well-meaning advice about how to salvage my broken life. And the terrible irony was that their advice was getting more generous and caring, as their estimation of my capabilities grew lower and lower. The conversation about my supposed career salvation was interrupted by the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway. Through the dining room window, I could see a sleek black Mercedes pulling up behind Cameron's BMW, its pristine paint job gleaming under the porch lights. My stomach dropped as I recognized the vehicle and, more importantly, recognized who was stepping out of it. Who could that be at this hour? Mom wondered aloud, glancing toward the window with mild curiosity. We weren't expecting anyone else. My heart began to race as I watched the tall, impeccably dressed figure of Jonathan Hartwell step out of the Mercedes and straighten his tie. Even in the dim evening light, there was no mistaking the commanding presence of the man who owned the most prestigious law firm in Riverside, and who also happened to be one of my most important business associates. "Oh my God," Cameron breathed, his fork clattering to his plate as he followed my gaze out the window. That's Mr. Hartwell, that's my boss." The entire table turned to look, and I could feel my carefully constructed world beginning to tilt on its axis. Jonathan Hartwell was here, at my family's home, and he was walking toward the front door with the confident stride of someone who had important business to conduct. "Your boss?" Dad repeated, his voice rising with excitement and confusion. What would he be doing here? Cameron was already standing up, frantically smoothing his hair and adjusting his expensive suit jacket. "I have no idea. Maybe there's some kind of emergency case?" "But why would he come here instead of calling?" Penelope grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. "Cameron, this could be huge. Partners don't just show up at associates' family dinners unless something really important is happening. Maybe you're getting promoted again." The speculation around the table grew more excited by the second, but I felt like I was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. Jonathan Hartwell wasn't here to see Cameron. He was here to see me, and I knew exactly why. 3 weeks ago, Hartwell and Associates had found themselves in serious financial trouble. A major lawsuit had gone badly, and they were facing bankruptcy within 6 months, unless they could find emergency funding or a buyer. Cameron, of course, knew nothing about this. Junior associates weren't privy to information about the firm's precarious financial position. But I knew, because Jonathan Hartwell had come to me. Clearwater Consulting had a reputation for discreetly helping prestigious companies navigate financial crises without public embarrassment. When Jonathan had reached out through intermediaries, requesting a confidential meeting about restructuring options, I had agreed to see him, not because I needed his business, but because I was curious about the firm where my brother worked. The meeting had taken place in my office at Clearwater Tower, with Jonathan having no idea that the CEO he was desperately seeking help from was the sister of one of his own associates. We'd spent 2 hours going over Hartwell and Associates' finances, and I'd presented him with 3 options: a structured bankruptcy that would preserve some dignity, a merger with a larger firm that would likely result in significant layoffs, or a private acquisition that would keep the firm intact and all employees secure. He'd asked about the third option, with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. I told him I would consider it and get back to him within the month. What I hadn't told him was that I'd already made my decision. I was going to buy Hartwell & Associates, not because it was a particularly good investment, but because it would mean securing Cameron's job and the jobs of everyone who worked there. Even after years of his cruelty, he was still my brother, and I couldn't stand the thought of him losing his career. But I'd also told Jonathan that any acquisition would be contingent on a face-to-face meeting with the current ownership, and that this meeting would need to take place before the end of the month. Today was the 28th. The doorbell rang, and the sound seemed to echo through the dining room like a gunshot. Everyone at the table froze, staring at each other with various expressions of excitement, confusion, and anticipation. "I'll get it," Dad said, starting to rise from his chair. "No, let me," Cameron interjected quickly, already moving toward the hallway. "He's here to see me, obviously. This must be about work." I remained seated, my hands folded in my lap, watching this scene unfold with a mixture of dread and fascination. In about 30 seconds, my carefully maintained double life was going to collide with reality in the most spectacular way possible. Through the archway, I could hear Dad opening the front door and Cameron's voice, pitched higher than usual with nervous excitement. "Mr. Hartwell, sir!" What an unexpected pleasure. "Please, come in." "Thank you, Cameron," came Jonathan's distinctive baritone voice, followed by the sound of expensive shoes on the hardwood floor of our family's modest entryway. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I have some urgent business to discuss, and I was told I could find the party I need to speak with here." "Of course, sir," Cameron replied, his voice practically vibrating with eagerness. "Whatever you need. Should we step into Dad's study? Or perhaps—" "Actually," Jonathan's voice interrupted, "I believe the person I need to speak with is in your dining room." There was a moment of confused silence, and then the sound of footsteps approaching. I could hear Cameron's bewildered voice. "In the dining room? Sir, I'm not sure I understand. The only people here are family." And then Jonathan Hartwell appeared in the dining room doorway, his silver hair perfectly styled, his charcoal suit impeccable, even after what had clearly been a long day. His eyes swept the room, taking in the birthday decorations, the half-finished dinner, the confused faces of my family members, before finally settling on me. "Miss Clearwater," he said, his voice carrying the weight of respect and recognition that I never heard at family gatherings. "I hope I'm not interrupting your family celebration." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Every person at that table was staring at me, trying to process what they had just heard. Cameron appeared behind Jonathan, his face a mask of complete bewilderment. "Sir, I think there might be some confusion. This is my sister Victoria. She's not involved in any legal matters that I'm aware of." Jonathan turned to look at Cameron with an expression of polite surprise. "Your sister? I had no idea. What an interesting coincidence." He turned back to me, and I could see the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Clearwater, I believe we have that appointment to discuss the Hartwell acquisition." The words hung in the air like a bomb with a lit fuse. I could feel every eye in the room fixed on me, could sense the wheels turning in their heads as they tried to make sense of what they were hearing. Cameron's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Acquisition?" I looked around the table at the faces of my family, the people who had spent the evening discussing my need for a filing job, who had been planning my rescue from my supposed failures, who had just offered me a $30,000 per year customer service position as if it were a generous gift. And then I looked at Jonathan Hartwell, standing in our dining room doorway in his $5,000 suit, treating me with the respect and deference that multi-million-dollar deals commanded. Yes, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the chaos I could feel building around me. The acquisition. I believe we scheduled this meeting for tonight. Uncle Theodore's wine glass slipped from his nerveless fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound sharp and final in the stunned silence. But nobody moved to clean it up. They were all too busy staring at me, trying to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the person who apparently had acquisitions to discuss with one of the most powerful lawyers in the city. Cameron looked like he was about to faint. And I realized that there was no going back now. 7 years of carefully maintained deception was about to end, not gradually or on my terms, but explosively and in front of everyone who mattered most. The moment I had both dreaded and anticipated for so long had finally arrived. The shattered wine glass on the floor seemed to break the spell that had frozen everyone in place. Suddenly, the dining room erupted into a cacophony of confused voices, all talking at once, all demanding explanations that I wasn't sure I was ready to give. "Acquisition?" Cameron repeated, his voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. "What acquisition? Victoria, what is he talking about?" "Now wait just a minute," Dad interjected, standing up so quickly that his chair nearly toppled backward. "Mr. Hartwell, I think there's been some kind of mistake. Our Victoria doesn't have anything to do with acquisitions or business deals. She makes jewelry." Jonathan Hartwell looked around the room with the patient expression of someone accustomed to explaining complex situations to confused parties. "I assure you, Mr. Clearwater, there's no mistake. Your daughter and I have been in negotiations for several weeks regarding the potential acquisition of my law firm by her company, Clearwater Luxury Brands." The words hit the room like a physical force. Penelope actually gasped out loud. Aunt Beatrice dropped her fork with a clatter. Uncle Theodore's mouth fell open so wide I could see his dental work. "That's impossible," Cameron said, his voice shaking. "Victoria doesn't own a company. She barely owns anything. She lives in a tiny apartment and drives a car that's falling apart." I could feel all eyes turning to me, demanding an explanation, an admission that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. For a moment, I considered maintaining the fiction. I could claim confusion, suggest that Mr. Hartwell had the wrong person, maybe even laugh it off as a case of mistaken identity. But as I looked around the table at these people who had spent the evening dissecting my supposed failures and planning my rescue from imaginary poverty, something inside me finally snapped. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos with startling clarity, "he has the right person." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to have stopped ticking. Cameron was the first to find his voice. "What do you mean?" I stood up slowly, smoothing down my target dress, and for the first time in 7 years, I allowed my real self to show through the carefully constructed facade I'd been maintaining. "I mean," I said, looking directly at Cameron, "that Mr. Hartwell is here to discuss my potential acquisition of Hartwell & Associates. Your law firm is in financial trouble, and they've approached my company for help." "Your company?" Mom whispered, as if the words themselves were too foreign to say at normal volume. "Clearwater Luxury Brands," I confirmed. "Annual revenue last year was $180 million. We employ 847 people across 3 states. We're headquartered in Clearwater Tower downtown, you know, that new building you can see from the highway." Dad's face had gone completely white. You own that building?" "I own the building, the company, and several subsidiary businesses. The little jewelry hobby you've all been mocking has been my cover story. I've been running a multi-million-dollar business empire for the past 7 years, while you've been treating me like a charity case." Cameron looked like he'd been struck by lightning. That's not possible. You can't. I would have known. Someone would have told me." Jonathan Hartwell cleared his throat diplomatically. "Actually, Cameron, your sister has been extraordinarily discreet about her business operations. Most of our negotiations have been conducted through intermediaries. I only learned her identity a few weeks ago when she agreed to meet with me personally." "But the apartment," Penelope sputtered. "The car, the clothes." I smiled, and for the first time in years it felt completely genuine. "Props. The apartment on Maple Street that you think I live in. I rent it specifically to maintain this fiction. My actual home is in Hillcrest, about 3 houses down from yours, Cameron. The Honda is one of several cars I own. I drive it to family events because it fits the image you have of me." Cameron's legs seemed to give out, and he collapsed back into his chair. "3 houses down," he repeated numbly. "You live 3 houses down from me." "I've watched your boys learning to ride their bikes in your driveway," I continued. "I've seen you mowing your lawn on Sunday mornings. I've been your neighbor for 2 years, and you never knew it because you were so convinced I was a failure that you couldn't conceive of me living in your neighborhood." Uncle Theodore was frantically scrolling through his phone, presumably searching for information about Clearwater luxury brands. His face grew paler with each swipe. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Forbes, Business Weekly, there are articles. Victoria, you're famous." "Anonymously famous," I corrected. "I've been very careful to keep my personal life separate from my business identity. Most publications use only my initials, or refer to me as V. Clearwater to protect my privacy." Aunt Beatrice was staring at me like I'd sprouted a second head. "But the customer service job," she stammered. "I offered you a customer service job." "For $30,000 a year," I nodded. "Which, for perspective, is approximately what my companies earn in profit every 6 hours. The number hung in the air like an accusation. Mrs. Patterson was clutching her chest dramatically. Uncle Theodore was making small whimpering sounds, and Cameron looked like he might be sick. "But why?" Mom asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you lie to us? Why would you let us think?" "Let you think what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Let you think I was a failure? Let you think I was useless? Let you think I needed your pity and your charity job offers?" I turned to face Cameron directly. "Do you remember what you said to me 20 minutes ago? You said I was worthless. You said I had no ambition, no vision, no ability to make tough decisions under pressure. You offered me a filing job like you were doing me the greatest favor in the world." Cameron's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "Well, here's a tough decision under pressure for you," I continued. "Your law firm is 6 months away from bankruptcy. The only thing standing between you and unemployment is my willingness to buy the company and keep everyone employed. So tell me, Cameron, who's worthless now?" The room erupted again, but this time it was Jonathan Hartwell's voice that cut through the chaos. "Perhaps," he said diplomatically, "we should discuss the business matter at hand. Miss Clearwater, I believe you mentioned you had reached a decision about our proposal." All eyes turned to me again, but this time the expressions weren't condescending or pitying. They were stunned, fearful, and desperately hopeful all at once. I looked at Cameron, who was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock, fear, and something that might have been respect. "I have indeed reached a decision," I said slowly. "I'm prepared to acquire Hartwell & Associates under the terms we discussed, with one modification." Cameron leaned forward, hanging on every word. "I want a full audit of all employees, including performance reviews, client satisfaction ratings, and productivity metrics. Anyone who isn't pulling their weight will be terminated during the transition." The threat was unmistakable, and Cameron understood it immediately. His job, his career, his entire future was now in the hands of the sister he'd been calling worthless just minutes earlier. "Miss Clearwater," Jonathan said, "that's perfectly reasonable. When would you like to finalize the paperwork?" I smiled, looking around the room at my family's shocked faces one more time. "Monday morning. Have your attorneys prepare the contracts. We'll handle the signing at my office in Clearwater Tower." And with that simple statement, I had just purchased my brother's workplace, secured the jobs of 200 employees, and completely destroyed every assumption my family had ever made about who I was and what I was capable of. The little girl they'd been trying to rescue had just become their rescuer, and I was just getting started. The silence that followed my announcement about acquiring Hartwell and Associates stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I could almost see the gears turning in everyone's minds as they struggled to process this complete reversal of everything they thought they knew about their family dynamics. Cameron was the first to break. "No," he said, shaking his head violently. "No, this is insane. This is some kind of elaborate joke. Victoria, you can't just decide you're a millionaire and expect us to believe it." His voice was rising with each word, taking on an edge of desperation that I'd never heard before. For the first time in our adult lives, Cameron was the one grasping for control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his understanding. "Cameron," I said quietly, "Mr. Hartwell can verify everything I've told you. Or you can simply Google Clearwater luxury brands on your phone." "I don't need to Google anything," he snapped, standing up so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I know my own sister. I've watched you struggle for years. I've seen your apartment, your car, your clothes. I've watched you barely scrape by While you what?" I interrupted, my voice cutting through his protest like a blade. "While you succeeded. While you achieved everything our parents wanted. While you became everything I supposedly couldn't be." Cameron's face flushed red, but whether from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. "Yes, exactly. I worked my ass off to get where I am. I earned my success through hard work and dedication, not by pretending to own companies that don't exist." Uncle Theodore looked up from his phone, his face pale. "Cameron," he said weakly, "the companies exist. Clearwater Luxury Brands it's real, the building is real. Jesus Christ, Victoria, there are photos of you in business magazines." Cameron whirled to face Uncle Theodore. "What are you talking about?" "Look," Uncle Theodore said, holding up his phone with a trembling hand. "Business Journal, 3 months ago. Young entrepreneur revolutionizes fashion industry. That's her. That's Victoria." I watched as Cameron snatched the phone from Uncle Theodore's hands, staring at the screen with growing horror. In the photo, I was standing in the lobby of Clearwater Tower, wearing a $3,000 business suit and the kind of confident smile I never allowed myself to show at family gatherings. "This is impossible," Cameron whispered, but his voice lacked the conviction it had held just moments before. Penelope grabbed the phone from Cameron's nerveless fingers, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the screen as she scrolled through the article. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Cameron, this is real. She's actually famous." "I'm not famous," I corrected mildly. "I'm successful. There's a difference." Mom finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "But, sweetheart, why? Why would you hide this from us? We're your family. We love you." The word love hung in the air between us, and I felt something bitter and long suppressed rise up in my throat. "Love?" I repeated. "Is that what you call it when you spend 7 years telling someone they're worthless? When you offer them filing jobs as if you're doing them a favor? When you discuss their failures like they're not sitting right there listening to every word?" "We were trying to help," Dad protested, his voice defensive. "We were worried about you. We wanted you to succeed." "No," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You wanted me to succeed on your terms, in ways that you understood and approved of. You wanted me to follow Cameron's path, to validate your definition of success. You never wanted me to find my own way." Cameron was still staring at the phone, scrolling through more articles, more photos, more evidence of a life he'd never known existed. "This can't be right," he muttered. "If you were really this successful, I would have known. Someone at the firm would have mentioned it." "Why would they?" I asked. "I've gone to great lengths to keep my personal and professional lives separate. Most people in the business world know me as V. Clearwater, if they know my name at all. And why would anyone at your law firm connect the struggling jewelry maker you occasionally mention to one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the state?" Aunt Beatrice was frantically scrolling through her own phone now, her face growing more horrified by the second. "Forbes," she whispered. "You're in Forbes. Top 30 under 30 entrepreneurs. Victoria, you're worth— oh my God, how much are you worth?" I looked around the room at their expectant faces, these people who had spent the evening discussing my need for a $30,000 per year customer service job. "Enough," I said simply. "That's not an answer," Cameron demanded, some of his old arrogance returning. "If you're going to make these ridiculous claims, at least have the courage to back them up with specifics." I studied my brother's face, seeing the desperation beneath his aggressive tone. He needed me to be lying. He needed this to be some elaborate fantasy because the alternative, that I had achieved more in 7 years than he had in his entire life, was too threatening to his sense of himself. "Fine," I said. "My personal net worth as of last quarter's valuation is approximately $47 million. The companies are worth considerably more than that, but my personal assets total just under $50 million. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Mrs. Patterson actually gasped and clutched her chest. Uncle Theodore's phone slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. Dad sank back into his chair as if his legs had given out. Cameron's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, something that looked almost like panic. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice was weak now, lacking any real conviction. "Is it?" I asked. "Is it really so impossible that the daughter you dismissed as worthless might have actually built something meaningful? Is it so hard to believe that maybe, just maybe, you've been wrong about me for the past 7 years?" Penelope was still scrolling through articles on Uncle Theodore's phone, her face growing paler with each new discovery. "Cameron," she said quietly, "there are dozens of articles, interviews, awards. She spoke at Harvard Business School last year." "Harvard?" Mom repeated faintly. "Yes," I confirmed. "I've given lectures at Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton. I'm frequently invited to speak about entrepreneurship and business development. Last month, I was the keynote speaker at the National Small Business Convention." Cameron ran his hands through his hair, destroying the perfect styling he'd been so proud of earlier. "This doesn't make sense," he said, his voice taking on an almost pleading quality. "If you're really this successful, why are you living like a failure?" I finished. "Like someone who needs your help and your pity? Maybe because that's exactly how you wanted to see me." The accusation hung in the air between us, and I could see Cameron struggling to formulate a response that wouldn't confirm what we both knew to be true. Uncle Theodore had retrieved his phone and was showing the screen to Dad, who was staring at an article titled "The Secret Success: How One Woman Built a Fashion Empire While Flying Under the Radar." "This is her," Uncle Theodore was saying, his voice hollow with shock. "This is really her. Look at the employee count. Look at the revenue numbers. Look at the expansion plans." Jonathan Hartwell, who had been standing quietly in the doorway throughout this family meltdown, finally cleared his throat. "If I may," he said diplomatically, "I can confirm that Ms. Clearwater is indeed who she claims to be. Clearwater Luxury Brands has been thoroughly vetted by our financial team as part of the acquisition discussions. They are more than capable of purchasing our firm." Cameron turned to stare at his boss, the man he'd been desperately trying to impress for years, the person whose approval had meant everything to his sense of professional worth. "Sir," he said weakly, "you're really going to sell the firm to my sister?" "I'm going to sell the firm to a successful businesswoman who has the resources and expertise to keep us solvent," Jonathan replied. "The fact that she happens to be your sister is interesting, but irrelevant to the business decision." And there it was, the final nail in the coffin of Cameron's worldview. His boss, his mentor, the person he'd looked up to and tried to emulate, was treating me with the kind of respect and deference that Cameron had always craved for himself. "I don't understand," Penelope said, her voice small and confused. "If you're really this successful, why didn't you ever tell us? Why let us think? Think what? I asked. Think I was worthless? Think I needed your charity? Think I was the family disappointment who couldn't get her life together? I looked around the room at their stricken faces, these people who had spent years making me feel small and insignificant, and felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I let you think those things, I said quietly, because that's what you wanted to think. Because it was easier for all of you to believe that I was the failure than to consider that maybe your definition of success was too narrow, maybe too cruel. The room had descended into a frantic chaos of fact-checking and phone scrolling as each family member desperately tried to verify what seemed impossible. The clicking of fingers on screens filled the silence between shocked exclamations and whispered discoveries. "Here," Uncle Theodore announced, his voice shaky as he held up his phone. "Riverside Business Quarterly, 6 months ago. Local company creates 800 jobs, revitalizes downtown district." They're talking about Clearwater Tower and the economic impact of your company. He looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between awe and terror. "Victoria, according to this article, you're the largest private employer in Riverside. Larger than the hospital. Larger than the university." Dad grabbed the phone with trembling hands, reading the article aloud in a voice that cracked with each word. "Clearwater Luxury Brands has single-handedly transformed the economic landscape of downtown Riverside, bringing high-paying jobs and attracting other businesses to the area. This is about you?" "The building project alone employed 300 construction workers for 18 months, I confirmed. We've also contracted with 17 local suppliers and service providers. The economic ripple effect has been significant." Mom was staring at her own phone screen, her face pale as parchment. "There's a video here," she whispered, "from the Chamber of Commerce dinner last year. You're receiving an award." She turned the phone toward the rest of the table, and I watched my family's faces as they saw me on the small screen, standing at a podium in an elegant black evening gown, accepting the Business Leader of the Year award from the mayor himself. "That's the Municipal Palace Ballroom," Penelope said faintly. "I've been to charity events there. That's where all the most important people in the city go." In the video, Mayor Richardson was speaking. "This year's recipient has demonstrated exceptional leadership in business innovation, job creation, and community investment. Please join me in congratulating Victoria Clearwater, CEO of Clearwater Luxury Brands, our Business Leader of the Year." The applause from the video seemed to echo in our silent dining room as my family watched me shake hands with the mayor, accept a crystal trophy, and give a brief acceptance speech that none of them had ever heard. "You know the mayor," Cameron said, as if this single fact somehow made everything else real in a way the financial figures hadn't. "I serve on the Economic Development Board with him," I replied. "We have lunch once a month to discuss city planning initiatives." Aunt Beatrice had found something else, her fingers trembling as she scrolled. "There's a whole section in the state business directory," she said. "Clearwater Luxury Brands, Victoria Clearwater, CEO and founder." It lists all 3 divisions, all the retail locations, even the subsidiary companies. She paused, squinting at the screen. "Wait, Meridian Manufacturing? That's the company that supplies uniforms to all the city workers. You own that too?" "I acquired them 2 years ago when they were struggling with cash flow," I explained. "They were going to lay off 60 employees. Now they're profitable and expanding." "Stellar Consulting Group," Uncle Theodore read from his own search. "Luxury retail specialist. You own this one too?" "I founded it 3 years ago. We help other fashion companies optimize their operations and expand their market reach." The evidence was mounting like an avalanche, each new discovery making my claims more undeniable. But it was Mrs. Patterson who found the piece of proof that seemed to finally break through their disbelief. "Oh my word," she gasped, staring at her phone screen. "Victoria, there's a whole article here about your charitable donations. Anonymous donations. but they've traced them back to your companies." She began reading, her voice growing more amazed with each item. 500,000 to the Children's Hospital, 250,000 to the Literacy Program, 100,000 to the homeless shelter, 300,000 to establish a scholarship fund for women entrepreneurs. The numbers kept coming, a litany of generosity that I'd never wanted to make public. Donations I'd made quietly, through foundations and shell companies, because I believed in the causes, not because I wanted recognition. "The total," Mrs. Patterson whispered, "over the past 3 years, it's over $2 million in charitable contributions." Cameron sank into his chair as if all the air had gone out of him. $2 million, he repeated numbly. "You've donated $2 million to charity while you've been offering me a filing job at your law firm," I finished quietly. Jonathan Hartwell spoke into the silence, his voice carrying the weight of professional authority. "If I may add some perspective," he said, "during our due diligence process, we discovered that Ms. Clearwater's companies consistently rank in the top 5% for employee satisfaction, benefits packages, and workplace culture. She's built something truly remarkable." Dad looked up from the phone he'd been staring at, his eyes red-rimmed and confused. "The awards," he said hoarsely. "There are so many awards. Entrepreneur of the Year, Innovation in Business, Rising Star in Fashion. How did we not know about any of this?" "Because you never asked," I said simply. "Every time I tried to talk about my work, you dismissed it as playing with beads or, quote, craft projects. You decided what my life looked like, without ever bothering to investigate whether your assumptions were accurate." Penelope was scrolling through what appeared to be a fashion blog, her face growing more astonished by the second. "These are your designs," she said, showing Cameron the screen. "This necklace costs $4,000. This bracelet is $6,000. People are buying them." "Celebrities are buying them," Mom corrected, reading over Penelope's shoulder. "Look at this." Victoria Clearwater's designs have become the must-have accessories for Hollywood's elite. There are photos of movie stars wearing your jewelry to award shows. The surreal nature of the evening was crystallizing into an undeniable reality. The daughter they'd pitied was not only successful, but famous within her industry. The sister Cameron had dismissed as worthless had built an empire that dwarfed anything he'd achieved. Uncle Theodore found another article, this one from the Wall Street Journal. "Listen to this," he said, his voice hollow. "Clearwater Luxury Brands represents a new model of sustainable luxury manufacturing, combining artisanal craftsmanship with modern business practices. Under the leadership of founder Victoria Clearwater, the company has achieved remarkable growth while maintaining its commitment to ethical production and fair labor practices." He looked up at me with something approaching reverence. "The Wall Street Journal wrote about your business practices. You're not just successful, you're influential." "The fashion industry is watching what we do," I confirmed. "We've pioneered several sustainability initiatives that other companies are now adopting." I was invited to speak at the Global Fashion Summit in Copenhagen last year about ethical luxury manufacturing. Cameron's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Copenhagen. You spoke in Copenhagen." "I've spoken in 12 countries over the past 3 years," I said. "Milan, Paris, Tokyo, London. The business has an international presence now." Aunt Beatrice was staring at a financial website on her phone, her face completely white. "The valuation," she said faintly. "According to this business analysis site, if your company went public, it would be valued at—" "Oh my God, Victoria, it would be worth over $400 million. $400 million. The number seemed to echo in the sudden silence, a figure so large that it defied their ability to process it. "That's just an estimate," I said modestly. "Market valuations can be inflated. But yes, the company has significant value." Jonathan Hartwell nodded approvingly. "Which is precisely why we're so pleased that Ms. Clearwater is considering our acquisition proposal. The financial stability and business expertise she brings will ensure that Hartwell and Associates not only survives but thrives." Cameron looked at his boss with something that might have been desperation. "Sir, you're really going to sell our firm to her?" "Cameron," Jonathan said gently, "I'm going to sell our firm to one of the most successful business leaders in the state, someone who has built multiple companies, created hundreds of jobs, and demonstrated exceptional leadership abilities. The fact that this person happens to be your sister is irrelevant to the business decision, though I admit it's quite remarkable." He turned to me with the kind of respect I'd grown accustomed to in professional settings but had never experienced in this house. "Miss Clearwater, shall we schedule a formal meeting for Monday to finalize the acquisition details?" I looked around the room at my family's stunned faces, at the phones still displaying evidence of my success, at the shattered remains of their assumptions scattered across the dinner table like broken glass. "Yes," I said calmly, "Monday morning at 10. I'll have my attorneys prepare the necessary documentation." And with those words, I had just scheduled the purchase of my brother's entire professional world, while he sat there realizing that the sister he'd called worthless was about to become his boss. The shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable, like the moment when storm clouds finally break and unleash everything they've been holding back. The evidence was irrefutable, the reality undeniable, and now my family was beginning to understand the true scope of what had just happened. I was no longer the family failure they needed to rescue. I was the person who held all the power. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my target dress one final time, knowing it would be the last time I ever wore this costume of deliberate mediocrity to a family gathering. When I spoke, my voice carried the quiet authority I used in boardrooms, the tone that commanded attention from CEOs and investors. "Since we're all finally on the same page about who I am and what I've built," I said, looking around the table at their shocked faces, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about how this family has operated for the past 7 years." Cameron started to speak, but I held up a hand, and he immediately fell silent. The gesture was small, but the power dynamic it represented was enormous. For the first time in our adult lives, I was the one setting the terms of our interaction. "Cameron," I said, turning to face my brother directly, "let's start with you. For 7 years, you've treated me like a charity case. You've mocked my work, dismissed my ambitions, and spoken to me like I was a child who couldn't understand basic concepts about success and failure." His face flushed, but he couldn't seem to find words to respond. "Just tonight," I continued, "you called me worthless. You suggested I had no vision, no leadership abilities, no capacity for making tough decisions. You offered me a filing job at your law firm like you were throwing a life preserver to a drowning woman." I paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room before delivering the blow that would complete our role reversal. "And now, Cameron, I want you to understand something very clearly. I am about to become your boss. When the acquisition is finalized on Monday, every decision about your career, your salary, your future at Hartwell & Associates will ultimately flow through me. The worthless sister you were trying to rescue now holds your professional life in her hands." The color drained from Cameron's face so completely that I thought he might faint. Penelope grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "Victoria," he whispered, "you wouldn't. You couldn't." "Couldn't what?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "Couldn't make tough decisions under pressure? Couldn't exercise leadership? Couldn't evaluate employee performance and make necessary changes? Because according to you, those are exactly the qualities I lack." I turned to address the rest of the family, each of whom was staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to terror to something that might have been newfound respect. "Uncle Theodore," I said, "you spent 20 minutes tonight explaining to me that I wasn't cut out for business, that the bravest thing I could do was admit defeat and find appropriate work. You suggested that some people are natural leaders and others are natural followers, and that I clearly fell into the second category." Uncle Theodore's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "I want you to know that tomorrow morning I'll be reviewing the insurance policies for all my companies. We currently spend about $2.3 million annually on business insurance. I'll be evaluating whether our current providers are meeting our needs or whether we should consider making some changes." The implication was crystal clear. Uncle Theodore's insurance company depended heavily on commercial accounts, and losing a client the size of Clearwater Luxury Brands would be devastating to his business. "Aunt Beatrice," I continued, turning to my father's sister, "you offered me a $30,000 per year customer service position tonight. You presented it as a generous opportunity, a chance for me to finally get my life together and achieve some small measure of stability." Aunt Beatrice was clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "I want you to know that Clearwater Luxury Brands has a customer service department with 47 employees. Our entry-level customer service representatives start at $45,000 per year, with full benefits, profit sharing, and opportunities for advancement. The department manager makes $95,000 annually. Perhaps you should consider whether your own company's compensation structure reflects current market standards." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Aunt Beatrice worked in human resources. She understood exactly what I was implying about her company's practices and her position within it. I turned to Mrs. Patterson, who had been watching the systematic dismantling of assumptions with growing horror. "Mrs. Patterson, you compared me tonight to your nephew, who swallowed his pride and took a job at the City Parks Department after his business failed. You suggested that sometimes the wise thing is to accept that you're not cut out for entrepreneurship." Mrs. Patterson pressed her lips together, clearly afraid of what was coming next. "I want you to know that I serve on the city's Economic Development Board, which reviews all municipal contracts and supplier relationships. The Parks Department budget is something I'm quite familiar with, as are the private companies that provide services to the city. Perhaps your nephew made the right choice for him, but I hope you understand that not everyone needs to settle for municipal employment to find fulfillment." The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that it felt like a different universe from the one we'd inhabited an hour earlier. These people who had spent years making me feel small and insignificant were now hanging on my every word, afraid of what I might say or do next. But it was my parents' reaction that affected me most deeply. Mom and Dad were staring at me with expressions I'd never seen before, a mixture of awe, fear, and what might have been pride, if pride could coexist with the dawning realization of how badly they'd misjudged their own daughter. "Mom, Dad," I said, my voice softening slightly, "you spent this evening discussing my need for rescue from my supposedly failed life. You suggested that maybe you'd been enabling my delusions by not pushing me harder to accept reality and find appropriate work." Mom's eyes filled with tears, and Dad's hand was shaking as he reached for his water glass. "I want you to understand that while you were planning my rescue, I was planning something else entirely. That mortgage you've been struggling with, the one that's been keeping you awake at night, worried about your retirement and your ability to keep this house?" I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope, placing it on the table between us. "It's paid off," I said simply. "The house is yours, free and clear. Consider it a return on investment for all those years of believing I could amount to something, even when I seemed to be proving you wrong." Dad's hand trembled as he picked up the envelope, opening it to reveal the paid-in-full mortgage statement. Mom burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. "But Victoria," Dad whispered, "why didn't you tell us? Why let us worry? Why let us think? Why let you think I needed your help instead of letting you know I was in a position to help you?" I finished. "Because, Dad, you never asked what I actually needed. You decided what my life looked like and what kind of help I required without ever bothering to find out if your assumptions were correct." I looked around the room one final time, taking in the faces of my family members as they struggled to process this complete reversal of everything they thought they knew about power, success, and family dynamics. "Jonathan," I said, turning to Cameron's boss, "shall we step outside to discuss the preliminary details of the acquisition? I believe we have some logistics to work out before Monday's formal signing." Jonathan Hartwell nodded respectfully. "Of course, Ms. Clearwater. I have the initial paperwork in my car." As we moved toward the door, I could hear the stunned silence behind us, broken only by Mom's quiet crying and the sound of Dad reading the mortgage document over and over again. At the doorway, I turned back one last time. "Oh, and Cameron?" I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "On Monday, when you come to work, you'll be working for me. I suggest you think very carefully about how you'd like that professional relationship to begin." And with that, I walked out of the dining room where I'd been diminished and dismissed for 7 years, leaving behind a family that was finally beginning to understand who their worthless daughter really was. The conversation with Jonathan Hartwell on my parents' front porch was brief and professional. Under the soft glow of the porch light, we discussed transfer timelines, employee retention strategies, and the integration process that would begin Monday morning. He was impressed by my thoroughness, my attention to detail, and my genuine concern for maintaining the firm's reputation during the transition. "I have to say, Miss Clearwater," he said as he prepared to leave, "this has been one of the most unusual business negotiations of my career. I had no idea we were dealing with Cameron's sister." "Family relationships can complicate business decisions," I replied diplomatically. "But I want to assure you that this acquisition will be handled with complete professionalism. Every employee will be evaluated fairly based on their performance and contribution to the firm." Jonathan nodded, though I caught the slight emphasis he placed on his next words. "I'm sure Cameron will appreciate that fairness." As his Mercedes pulled out of the driveway, I stood alone on the porch for a moment, gathering myself before returning to face my family. Through the dining room window, I could see them still seated around the table, engaged in what appeared to be an intense, whispered conversation. Mom was still clutching the mortgage papers, Dad was staring blankly at his plate, and Cameron looked like he was on the verge of a complete breakdown. When I walked back into the dining room, the conversation stopped abruptly. 7 pairs of eyes tracked my movement as I returned to my seat, but the dynamic was completely different now. Where before they had looked at me with pity or condescension, now there was wariness, respect, and in some cases, fear. "Well," I said, settling back into my chair with the same calm demeanor I used to chair board meetings, "now that the business matters are settled, perhaps we should address the personal ones." Cameron was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Victoria, I don't know what to say." "An apology might be a good start," I suggested mildly. He ran his hands through his hair, destroying what remained of his perfect styling. "I'm sorry." "God, Victoria, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I believed." "You believed what you wanted to believe," I finished. "You needed me to be the failure so you could be the success. It's easier to feel good about your achievements when you have someone to compare them to unfavorably." Penelope leaned forward, her designer clothes and perfect makeup somehow looking less impressive now that she understood who she was actually talking to. "Victoria, we never meant to hurt you. We genuinely thought we were helping." "Did you?" I asked. "When you suggested tonight that even entry-level customer service would be a step up for me socially, were you thinking about helping me? Or were you reinforcing your own sense of superiority?" Penelope's face flushed red, and she had the grace to look ashamed. Uncle Theodore cleared his throat nervously. "Victoria, about what I said earlier, about you not being cut out for business, I obviously spoke out of ignorance." "You spoke out of arrogance," I corrected. "You assumed that because you couldn't see my success, it didn't exist. You made judgments about my capabilities based on incomplete information and your own biases." Aunt Beatrice was fidgeting with her phone, clearly uncomfortable. "The job offer I made, I realize now how it must have sounded." "How did it sound, Aunt Beatrice?" She struggled to find the words. Like I was doing you a charity. Like I was throwing you a lifeline because I felt sorry for you." "That's exactly how it sounded," I confirmed. "Because that's exactly what it was. You weren't offering me an opportunity. You were offering me your pity, wrapped up in the form of a minimum wage job." The room fell silent as the weight of their collective behavior settled over them. These were good people, I knew that. They weren't intentionally cruel or malicious. But their casual dismissal of my worth, their assumptions about my failures, their condescending offers of help, all of it had been devastating in its cumulative effect. Mom finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "Sweetheart, how do we fix this? How do we make up for 7 years of being so wrong about everything?" I looked at my mother, this woman who had raised me, who had celebrated my childhood achievements, who had somehow lost faith in my adult potential. "I don't know if you can fix it, Mom. Some things, once broken, don't go back to the way they were." Dad set down the mortgage papers and looked at me with eyes that seemed to have aged a decade in the past hour. "Victoria, why did you pay off our mortgage? After everything we've said, everything we've done, why would you help us?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself as I'd arranged the payment earlier that week. Because despite everything, you're still my parents. Because I remember the people you were before Cameron's success became the measuring stick for everyone else's worth. Because I wanted to prove that success doesn't have to make you cruel. Cameron flinched at the implied criticism, but he didn't argue with it. "There will be conditions, though," I continued, and I saw several people tense up around the table. "This family is going to change how it operates. The days of using me as your cautionary tale are over. The casual cruelty disguised as concern ends now." I turned to Cameron specifically. "Your employment at Hartwell & Associates will be completely separate from our family relationship. You'll be evaluated on your performance, your billable hours, your client satisfaction ratings, and your contribution to the firm's success. Nothing more, nothing less." Cameron nodded frantically. "Yes, of course, absolutely." "But," I continued, "if you ever again speak to me the way you spoke to me tonight, in any context, professional or personal, you'll be looking for new employment immediately. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear," he whispered. I looked around the table at each family member. "The same goes for all of you. I'm not your family failure anymore. I'm not your cautionary tale. I'm not the person you get to feel superior to or sorry for. I'm a successful businesswoman who happens to share your DNA, and I expect to be treated accordingly." Uncle Theodore raised his hand tentatively, like a nervous student. "Victoria, what about, will you still come to family gatherings? Will things be normal?" I considered the question carefully. "That depends on your definition of normal. If normal means pretending this conversation never happened and going back to the old patterns, then no. If normal means building new relationships based on mutual respect and honest communication, then maybe." Mrs. Patterson, who had been silent throughout most of this reckoning, finally spoke up. "Victoria, I owe you an apology. We all do. We made assumptions about your life without ever asking about your experiences. We treated you like a child instead of the accomplished woman you clearly are." "Thank you," I said simply. "That acknowledgement means more than you know." Penelope was still scrolling through articles about my company on her phone, her expression growing more amazed by the minute. "Victoria, I'm reading about your sustainability initiatives. You've revolutionized manufacturing practices in your industry. You're not just successful, you're influential on a global scale." "I've tried to build something meaningful," I replied. "Success without purpose feels hollow to me." Cameron looked up from his own phone, where he'd apparently been reading about the acquisition that would make me his boss. "The article says you plan to expand Hartwell & Associates' pro bono work and create a legal aid clinic for small businesses. Is that true?" "It's one of several initiatives I'm considering," I confirmed. "Your firm has excellent attorneys. I'd like to see that expertise used to help people who couldn't otherwise afford quality legal representation." For the first time all evening, Cameron's expression showed something other than fear or shock. There was a flicker of what might have been admiration, or at least respect. That's really admirable," he said quietly. "It's good business," I corrected. "Happy communities create stable economies. Stable economies benefit everyone." Dad picked up the mortgage papers again, staring at them like he still couldn't quite believe they were real. "Victoria, this house, it's been in our family for 30 years. You've given us security for the rest of our lives." "I've given you what you gave me," I said. "A foundation to build on. What you do with that foundation is up to you." The conversation continued for another hour, tentative and careful, as my family slowly began to recalibrate their understanding of who I was and where I fit in their world. It wasn't comfortable. There were awkward silences, nervous laughter, and moments of obvious discomfort as old patterns bumped up against new realities. But it was honest in a way our family conversations hadn't been for years. As the evening wound down and people began gathering their things to leave, Cameron approached me hesitantly. "Victoria," he said, his voice uncertain, "I know I have no right to ask this, but Monday morning when I come to work, will you be there? Will you be visible?" I studied my brother's face, seeing vulnerability there for the first time in years. "Why do you ask?" "Because," he said quietly, "I think I'd like the chance to see who my sister really is. The real you, not the version you've been showing us." It was a small gesture, but it felt like the beginning of something that might eventually resemble a genuine relationship between siblings. "Yes," I said finally. "I'll be there." 3 months had passed since that transformative evening at Dad's 65th birthday party, and the ripple effects of that night continued to reshape every relationship in our family. As I sat in my real office on the 38th floor of Clearwater Tower, reviewing the quarterly reports that showed another record-breaking period of growth, I reflected on how profoundly everything had changed. The acquisition of Hartwell and Associates had been completed smoothly, exactly as planned. The integration process had been remarkably seamless, partly because of Jonathan Hartwell's professionalism, but mostly because I had been very strategic about maintaining the firm's culture while implementing necessary improvements. Employee morale had actually increased since the acquisition, thanks to better benefits, clearer advancement opportunities, and the new pro bono initiative that was already making a positive impact in the community. Cameron had surprised me. In the weeks following that evening, he had thrown himself into his work with a dedication that went beyond mere job security. He seemed genuinely motivated to prove himself on merit rather than coasting on family connections or firm politics. His billable hours had increased, his client satisfaction ratings had improved, and he had volunteered to lead the new small business legal aid clinic that was launching next month. More importantly, he had started treating me like an actual person rather than a convenient target for his superiority complex. "Victoria?" My assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Cameron Clearwater is here for his appointment." I smiled slightly. Cameron had requested monthly check-ins to discuss his performance and receive feedback, something he'd never done with Jonathan Hartwell. Whether this was driven by fear, ambition, or genuine desire for improvement, I wasn't entirely sure, but the results spoke for themselves. "Send him in, please." Cameron entered my office wearing a well-tailored suit that looked expensive but not ostentatious. He'd developed a more professional demeanor since the acquisition, less arrogant and more focused. He took the seat across from my desk and waited for me to speak, another change from his usual habit of dominating conversations. "Your quarterly review looks excellent," I began, sliding a folder across the desk. "Client retention is up 15%. Your efficiency ratings have improved significantly, and the feedback from the legal aid clinic has been overwhelmingly positive." Cameron opened the folder and scanned the performance metrics, his expression showing genuine surprise at the positive assessment. "Thank you. I've been working hard to earn my place here." "You have earned it," I said simply. "This review reflects your actual performance, Cameron. Not family favoritism, not old firm politics, just your work." He nodded, then looked up with an expression that seemed almost vulnerable. "Victoria, can I ask you something? And I want an honest answer, not a diplomatic one." "Of course." "Do you think I was always capable of this level of performance? Or have I actually improved since you took over?" It was a thoughtful question, one that showed genuine self-reflection. I considered my answer carefully. "I think you were always capable," I said finally. "But I think the old system at Hartwell and Associates rewarded networking and politics over actual results. You adapted to that system because it worked for you. Now the system rewards performance and results, so you've adapted to that instead. Cameron was quiet for a moment, processing this assessment, so I was coasting. You were playing the game that existed, I corrected. The difference is that now there's a better game to play. He laughed, though it wasn't entirely humorous. It's strange having my sister as my boss, but also, I think I might actually respect you more now than I ever did before. Even though I'm the same person I always was? No, Cameron said, shaking his head. You're not the same person. Or maybe you are, and I'm finally seeing you clearly. Either way, the person sitting across from me right now is someone I want to learn from. It was the most honest thing Cameron had said to me in years, perhaps ever. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of what might eventually become a genuine sibling relationship. I'd like that, I said. After Cameron left, I turned my chair to look out the window at the city of Riverside spread below. From this height, I could see the country club where Penelope held her charity events, the insurance building where Uncle Theodore worked, even the modest house on Sycamore Avenue where I'd grown up, and where my parents now lived mortgage-free. The family dynamics had stabilized into something healthier, though it had taken time. Sunday dinners at my parents' house had resumed, but with a completely different atmosphere. No one offered me career advice anymore. No one suggested I needed rescuing or guidance. Instead, they asked about my business with genuine interest, and I found myself sharing more about my work than I had in years. Uncle Theodore's insurance company had kept our account, though I'd made it clear that our continued business relationship depended on competitive rates and excellent service. He'd risen to the challenge, even implementing some customer service improvements based on suggestions from my team. Our professional relationship had actually strengthened both our businesses. Aunt Beatrice had been the most affected by our confrontation. Learning that her generous job offer had been so far below market standards had prompted her to research compensation practices in her industry. She'd ended up pushing for salary increases across her company and had actually been promoted to senior HR director as a result. She still thanked me occasionally for opening her eyes to better practices. Penelope had perhaps undergone the most surprising transformation. After learning about my charitable giving, she'd asked if I would consider partnering with her on some larger community initiatives. We'd ended up collaborating on a women's entrepreneurship program that provided both funding and mentorship for female business owners. Her event planning skills and my business expertise had proven to be an effective combination. My parents had struggled the most with the adjustment. The revelation that their unsuccessful daughter was actually the most accomplished member of the family had forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about success, family, and their own parenting. That they'd made genuine efforts to rebuild our relationship on healthier foundations. Mom had started asking about my work with real curiosity rather than polite concern. Dad had begun reading business journals and would sometimes call to discuss articles he'd found about entrepreneurship or industry trends. They'd both made efforts to understand the choices I'd made and to see my path as valid rather than disappointing. The mortgage payment remained a complicated gesture between us. They'd tried to refuse it initially, feeling they didn't deserve such generosity after years of dismissing my capabilities. But I'd insisted, explaining that financial security would allow them to support Cameron's children's education and pursue some of the retirement dreams they'd put on hold. It wasn't about them deserving it. It was about family taking care of family when they had the means to do so. Mrs. Patterson had become one of my most enthusiastic supporters, telling anyone who would listen about her friend's daughter who owned that big building downtown. It was amusing, though I appreciated that her bragging came from genuine pride rather than reflected glory. The most significant change, however, was in myself. For 7 years, I'd lived a double life, compartmentalizing my success and diminishing myself to fit other people's expectations. The relief of finally living authentically was immense. I no longer had to remember which version of myself to present in different contexts. I could simply be Victoria Clearwater, successful businesswoman, philanthropist, and daughter who happened to have built an empire while her family wasn't looking. My phone buzzed with a text from Cameron. Thanks for the honest feedback today. Looking forward to presenting the legal aid clinic proposal next week. Also, Mom wants to know if you're coming to Sunday dinner and if you'd like her to make that apple pie you used to love. I smiled and typed back, yes to both, and tell her she doesn't have to cook for an army anymore. I eat the same amount I always did. His response came quickly. She says she's making extra anyway because she wants leftovers to send home with you. Some things never change. Some things never change, but the important things had changed completely. I was no longer the family member who needed care packages and leftover food. I was the one who could provide security and opportunities for others. But Mom still wanted to send me home with apple pie, and somehow that felt like the perfect balance between my old life and my new one. As the sun set over Riverside, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I gathered my things and prepared to leave the office. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new decisions that would affect hundreds of employees and millions in revenue. But tonight, I was going home to my real house in Hillcrest, where I could be exactly who I was without performance or pretense. The secretary I'd pretended to be for 7 years was gone forever. The CEO I'd always been was finally free to exist fully in every aspect of my life, and the family that had once seen me as their greatest disappointment was slowly learning to see me as I truly was. Not perfect, not without flaws, but successful on my own terms and strong enough to lift others up rather than tear them down. It had taken a dramatic revelation at a birthday party to get here, but sometimes the most important truths require the most dramatic unveiling. The girl who had once been small enough to fit in their narrow definitions of success had grown into a woman who could redefine success for everyone around her. And that, I thought, as I locked my office door and headed home, was worth every difficult conversation it had taken to get here. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.